The hardest prison is the one you build inside your own mind. I repeated those words to myself every morning, hoping that one day I would finally believe them. My name is Ethan Carter. I was 27 years old, and for nearly as long as I could remember, I had convinced myself that something inside me needed to be repaired. Not because anyone had ever looked at me with hatred, and not because I had lived a miserable life. My job as an architect in Chicago was steady, my family loved me in their own imperfect way, and I had loyal friends who would answer my phone calls at any hour of the day. Yet every time I caught myself smiling a little too long, whenever Bennett Brooks walked into a room, an invisible voice whispered the same sentence. This has to stop. Bennett had been my best friend since our first semester of college. 8 years had passed, and somehow he still knew me better than anyone else. He remembered my favorite coffee order before I did. He noticed when I skipped lunch because I was buried in work. He could tell I was anxious simply by watching me straighten the sleeves of my jacket for the third time in 5 minutes. Most people called that friendship. I called it dangerous because every thoughtful thing he did only made forgetting him more impossible. The breaking point arrived during a Sunday family barbecue at my parents' house. My younger sister had just announced her engagement. Everyone applauded, and conversations naturally drifted toward weddings, relationships, and future plans. Then my uncle looked directly at me with an encouraging smile. So, Ethan, when are you finally going to bring a nice girl home? The question sounded harmless. Everyone around the table waited with patient smiles, expecting another light-hearted joke. I forced one anyway. I have been busy. Laughter followed, but inside I felt completely exhausted. On the drive back to my apartment that evening, I turned off the radio and sat in silence at every red light, replaying the conversation over and over again. By the time I reached home, I had made a decision that felt responsible, practical, and completely heartbreaking. I was going to fix myself. I would stop depending on Bennett. I would stop making excuses to see him every weekend. I would accept every blind date my coworkers suggested. I would become the version of myself everyone expected to see. Standing alone in my kitchen, I opened my phone and stared at Bennett's name at the top of my recent conversations. There were dozens of messages from the past week alone. Funny pictures, lunch plans, movie recommendations, simple questions asking whether I had eaten dinner. My thumb hovered over the screen before I quietly muted the conversation. This is better, I whispered, although nothing about it felt better. I walked to the living room and opened a notebook, writing a list titled New Beginning. Number 1. Spend less time with Bennett. Number 2. Say yes to more dates. Number 3. Stop imagining a future that could never happen. I had barely finished writing the final sentence when the doorbell rang. I frowned because nobody ever visited without calling first. As soon as I opened the door, every carefully organized plan inside my head collapsed. Bennett stood on my front porch wearing his familiar navy jacket, holding 2 cups of coffee with the same warm smile that had brightened countless ordinary days. I know Sundays are usually hard after family gatherings, he said cheerfully. So I brought your favorite coffee before you had the chance to pretend you were fine. I looked at the notebook still lying open on my coffee table behind me, then back at the one person I had just promised myself I would leave behind. And in that impossible moment, I realized the hardest part of fixing myself was that the person who always made me feel whole had just knocked on my front door. Bennett held out the second cup of coffee with the same easy smile he had worn for years, completely unaware that he had interrupted the most important promise I had ever made to myself. You look like you have seen a ghost, he joked as I stepped aside to let him into my apartment. Long weekend. I forced a smile that felt far less convincing than I hoped. Something like that. He walked inside as though my apartment were almost his own, placing the coffee on the kitchen counter before. Noticing the notebook I had forgotten to close. New beginning, he read aloud with an amused grin. That sounds serious. I moved a little too quickly, closing the notebook before he could read the list inside. Just work goals. Bennett raised one eyebrow but did not push the subject. That was one of the things that made being around him so difficult. He respected every boundary without making me feel guilty for having one. Instead of asking more questions, he simply handed me the coffee exactly the way I liked it, with a small splash of cream and no sugar. I figured you skipped breakfast, he said casually. Again, I looked at the cup in surprise. How did you know? He laughed softly. Because you always forget to eat after visiting your parents. I looked away before he could see the emotions gathering behind my eyes. He remembered everything. Every habit. Every routine. Every version of me that I wished I could hide. We spent the next hour watching a baseball game neither of us really cared about, talking about work projects and laughing over an embarrassing story from college. From the outside, it looked like another ordinary Sunday between lifelong friends. Inside my mind, however, every smile felt like another reason to leave. After Bennett finally headed home, I reopened the notebook and stared at the 3 promises I had written. My phone buzzed almost immediately. Bennett had sent a simple message. "Do not forget to eat dinner this time." I smiled before catching myself and placing the phone face down on the table. "This has to change," I whispered. The following Monday, I accepted the first invitation I normally would have declined. My coworker Melissa had been trying to introduce me to her friend Lauren for nearly 3 months. Every previous excuse had disappeared the moment I decided to rebuild my life. "Friday works," I told her. Melissa looked pleasantly surprised. Really? By Friday evening, I found myself sitting across from Lauren in a quiet Italian restaurant downtown. She was intelligent, funny, and genuinely kind. We talked about travel, favorite books, and architecture for nearly an hour. Anyone watching would have called it a successful first date. Then my phone vibrated beneath the table. I glanced down without thinking. "Bennett, good luck tonight. I hope she likes your terrible jokes as much as I do." I smiled before I could stop myself. Lauren noticed immediately. "Someone important?" she asked warmly. I locked my phone and answered too quickly. "Just my best friend." She smiled politely. "You must be close." I nodded. "We have known each other forever." The conversation continued, but something had shifted. Every funny story reminded me of Bennett because he had lived through most of them beside me. Every restaurant recommendation came from places Bennett and I had already visited. Every memory somehow led back to him. When the evening ended, Lauren thanked me sincerely and admitted she did not think we shared the kind of connection that should become something more. I agreed with complete honesty. As I walked toward my car beneath the cool Chicago evening sky, my phone rang again. "Bennett." I hesitated before answering. "How did it go?" he asked cheerfully. I looked across the quiet parking lot and closed my eyes for a moment. "It was nice," I answered truthfully. "Then why do you sound disappointed?" I searched for an explanation that would not reveal everything I was desperately trying to hide. None came. Because no matter how hard I tried to imagine a future that looked different, every road I followed somehow led back to the same person who had unknowingly become the center of every version of happiness I had ever pictured. After I hung up the phone, I sat alone inside my car for nearly 15 minutes without starting the engine. Bennett's simple question stayed with me far longer than the date itself. Why did I sound disappointed? The honest answer was painfully obvious. I had spent the entire evening trying to build a connection with someone kind and genuine, while unconsciously comparing every conversation, every laugh, and every comfortable silence to the friendship I already shared with Bennett. Nobody could compete with memories that stretched across 8 years. The realization should have convinced me to stop pretending. Instead, it made me even more determined to continue. Monday morning arrived with a new strategy. If spending less time with Bennett had not happened naturally, then I would make it happen intentionally. I stopped accepting his lunch invitations, telling him I had deadlines. I claimed overtime whenever he suggested watching a baseball game together. I even ignored a few of his messages for several hours before replying with short, polite answers. Every excuse sounded believable. Every excuse made me feel worse. Bennett never complained. He simply accepted every explanation with his usual understanding. Somehow that kindness made the distance even harder to maintain. By Thursday afternoon, Melissa stopped beside my desk carrying 2 coffees. "You look exhausted," she said. I smiled politely. "Busy week." She studied me for a second before asking, "Everything okay with your best friend?" I looked up in surprise. "Why would you ask that?" "Because you usually mention him at least once every conversation." She laughed lightly. "This week you have not mentioned him at all." I forced another smile. "He has been busy too." It was not true. Bennett had simply stopped asking as often after I kept saying no. That evening I stayed late at the office even though my project had already been finished. Walking into my apartment felt strangely quiet without the usual expectation that Bennett might text about dinner or ask whether I wanted to meet for coffee the next morning. I told myself the silence meant my plan was finally working. Then I opened the refrigerator and immediately noticed a small container labeled homemade chili. Eat before Sunday. Bennett. I stared at the familiar handwriting for several seconds before remembering that he had dropped it off earlier in the week while I was still at work. He had not asked me to come outside. He had not expected a conversation. He had simply wanted to make sure I would eat something besides takeout during another busy week. I closed the refrigerator door without touching the container because accepting another thoughtful gesture felt like breaking the promise I had made to myself. Saturday morning arrived, bringing our usual coffee time. For 8 straight years we had met at the same neighborhood cafe almost every weekend unless one of us was traveling. At 9 o'clock my phone remained silent. At 9:15 I found myself glancing toward it anyway. By 9:30 I was standing at my apartment window looking down at the street for no reason I could explain. Finally, just before 10, a message appeared. Hope you have a good weekend. No pressure. Just wanted you to know I miss hanging out with you. My chest tightened. There was no accusation. No complaint. Only honesty. Before I could answer, another memory surfaced without warning. Freshman year of college. My first architecture presentation had gone terribly, and I had walked halfway across campus convinced everyone thought I was a failure. Bennett had found me sitting alone outside the library with 2 hot chocolates. He never tried to fix the situation. He simply sat beside me until I smiled again. Another memory followed, helping me move into my first apartment after graduation. Waiting with me for 6 hours at the hospital when my father needed unexpected surgery. Driving through a snowstorm because my car would not start. None of those moments had anything to do with romance. They were simply the countless quiet ways Bennett had chosen me again and again without ever asking for recognition. I looked down at the unanswered message still glowing on my phone, suddenly realizing that every beautiful memory I treasured somehow carried the exact same face. And the more desperately I tried to erase him from my future, the more clearly I discovered he had already become the favorite part of my past. Monday morning began with an unexpected message from my mother asking whether I could spend the upcoming weekend at the family lake house. My sister and her fiancé were planning a small gathering before the wedding, and everyone was expected to attend. Normally, I would have answered yes without thinking twice. This time my thumb hovered above the screen while a familiar worry settled inside my chest. Family weekends almost always meant questions about relationships, future plans, and why I still spent so much time with Bennett. Before I could reply, another message appeared. Bennett, your mom invited me too. I guess we are both trapped. Despite everything I had been trying to do, I laughed out loud. That had always been his gift. Somehow he could make even uncomfortable situations feel lighter without pretending the problems did not exist. I answered only with a simple thumbs-up emoji before setting my phone aside. If I kept the conversation short enough, maybe the distance would become easier to maintain. It never did. Friday afternoon arrived, and we drove separately to the lake house even though we had always traveled together before. I convinced myself it was more practical because I needed to return to the city early on Sunday. The truth was much simpler. I was afraid that 2 quiet hours alone in a car with Bennett would completely destroy every wall I had spent weeks building. The autumn air felt crisp as I stepped onto the familiar wooden porch overlooking the lake. My parents welcomed everyone with warm hugs while my sister immediately organized games, dinner plans, and hiking trails for the next morning. Bennett blended naturally into every conversation, helping carry groceries inside before offering to prepare the outdoor grill with my father. Watching him laugh with my family felt strangely comforting, as though he had quietly belonged there long before anyone officially invited him. During dinner, my grandmother smiled across the table. You boys still finish each other's sentences. Bennett chuckled. That happens after 8 years. My grandmother nodded knowingly. Some connections only grow stronger with time. I lowered my eyes to my plate, hoping nobody would notice how uncomfortable those simple words made me feel. Later that evening, a sudden rainstorm rolled across the lake, canceling the bonfire everyone had planned. Instead, my sister suggested board games inside the large living room. The power flickered briefly before returning, and laughter quickly filled the house. Bennett sat beside me on the old sofa exactly as he always did. Whenever someone forgot a rule, we exchanged amused glances before laughing at the same time. Whenever snacks were passed around, he automatically handed me my favorite pretzels without asking. Every tiny habit reminded me how naturally our lives had intertwined over the years. As the games continued, my sister suddenly clapped her hands together with excitement. "I have an idea," she announced. "Everyone has to answer one honest question." Groans and laughter echoed through the room until she pointed directly at me. "Ethan, you first." I smiled nervously. "Of course." She thought for a second before asking, "What is the biggest secret you have ever kept from yourself?" The room became surprisingly quiet. My heartbeat immediately quickened because I already knew the answer. I had spent years pretending not to see it. Before I could force out another harmless joke, I felt Bennett glance toward me with quiet concern, and in that silent moment I realized the question my sister had asked was no longer about entertaining the family. It had become the exact question I had been desperately avoiding ever since I convinced myself that the only thing wrong with my life was the part of my heart that had never stopped choosing the same person. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. My sister smiled patiently, waiting for an answer while everyone else watched with the relaxed curiosity that came from believing this was only another harmless family game. I forced a quiet laugh and looked down at the deck of cards resting on the coffee table. "I guess my biggest secret," I finally said, choosing every word carefully, "is that I have spent too much time trying to become the person I thought everyone expected instead of figuring out who I actually am." The room became unexpectedly thoughtful. My father nodded slowly. "That is more honest than I expected." My grandmother smiled warmly. "Most people spend years learning that lesson." Around the room, the conversation moved naturally to the next person, but I noticed Bennett still watching me. He did not look confused. He looked concerned. It was the same expression he always wore whenever he sensed I was carrying something alone. Later that night, after everyone had gone upstairs, I stepped outside onto the quiet dock stretching across the calm lake. The rain had ended, leaving the air cool and fresh beneath a sky filled with bright stars. I leaned against the wooden railing, hoping the silence would finally slow my thoughts. A few moments later, I heard the familiar sound of footsteps behind me. "I thought I would find you here," Bennett said gently. I smiled without turning around. "You usually do." He joined me beside the railing, leaving enough space for both of us to feel comfortable. Neither of us spoke immediately. The gentle movement of the water filled the silence between us. "You have been different lately," Bennett finally said. "I know. Did I do something?" The question hurt more than I expected because it reminded me that my attempt to protect myself had quietly begun hurting the one person I never wanted to hurt. "No," I answered honestly. "You did not do anything wrong." Bennett folded his arms against the cool evening air. "Then why does it feel like you keep walking farther away every week?" I searched for an answer that would not reveal everything. None felt true enough. "Work has been stressful." He smiled sadly. "That explanation worked the first few times." His voice remained calm. "It does not anymore." I closed my eyes for a moment. "I just need some time." Bennett nodded, but I could tell he did not believe me. "You know," he said quietly, "I keep replaying the last few weeks in my head, trying to figure out what changed." He laughed softly, though there was very little humor in it. "I cannot find the moment where I lost my best friend." His words settled heavily inside my chest. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Melissa reminding me about another dinner she wanted to arrange with one of her friends the following week. I stared at the screen for several seconds before locking it again. Bennett noticed anyway. "Another date?" he asked politely. I nodded. "Probably." He looked back toward the lake. "Do you like her?" "I have not met her yet." "Then why keep saying yes?" I hesitated. The truthful answer sat only a few inches behind my lips. Because I was desperately trying to prove something to myself. Instead, I simply shrugged. "Maybe I just need to keep trying." Bennett looked at me with quiet disappointment before offering a small smile. "I hope whatever you are looking for," he said softly, "actually makes you happy." He turned and slowly walked back toward the house, leaving me alone beneath the stars. I watched him disappear through the back door before lowering my head into my hands. Every step he took away from me felt heavier than all the distance I had spent weeks trying to create. And for the first time, I began wondering whether the thing I had been calling self-improvement was actually nothing more than another name for fear. The drive back to Chicago felt longer than usual, even though the highway, the traffic, and the familiar skyline had not changed. Bennett and I exchanged polite messages after leaving the lake house. But the effortless rhythm we had shared for years seemed to have disappeared somewhere between that quiet conversation on the dock and the moment we said goodbye in my parents' driveway. Monday morning arrived with a full schedule at the architecture firm, and I welcomed every meeting because work demanded enough concentration to keep my thoughts occupied. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a calendar reminder for dinner with another woman Melissa had insisted I meet. I stared at the notification for several seconds before placing the phone back into my desk drawer. This was supposed to be progress. This was supposed to prove I was moving forward. Instead, it felt as though I was simply repeating the same mistake with different faces. That evening, the restaurant was comfortable, the conversation pleasant, and my dinner companion was thoughtful and easy to talk with. She asked about my career, my family, and the hobbies I enjoyed outside the office. When she smiled and asked who had influenced my life the most, the answer escaped before I had time to filter it. My best friend, I said naturally. He has always been there whenever life became complicated. She smiled warmly. You sound lucky. I am, I answered without hesitation. The certainty in my own voice surprised me. On the walk back toward the parking garage, I realized I had spent another evening describing Bennett more vividly than I had described myself. The following afternoon, Melissa stopped beside my desk again. So, she asked with an encouraging smile. How did it go? I thanked her sincerely before admitting that I did not think another date made sense. She looked disappointed for only a moment before gently asking, Can I tell you something without offending you? I nodded. Every time you talk about finding the right person, you end up talking about Bennett instead. My heartbeat immediately quickened. I tried to laugh, but the sound never came. Melissa continued carefully. I do not know your whole story, and it is none of my business. I only know that I have never seen someone describe another person with that much admiration while insisting they are looking somewhere else. Her words followed me for the rest of the afternoon. After work, I returned home feeling more emotionally exhausted than physically tired. While searching for an old sketchbook inside the hallway closet, a small storage box slipped from the top shelf and scattered its contents across the floor. Photographs, ticket stubs, postcards, and handwritten notes spread around my feet like forgotten pieces of another lifetime. Every single memory somehow included Bennett. There was a photograph from our freshman orientation, another from a cross-country road trip after graduation, movie tickets from countless weekends, and a folded birthday card he had written years earlier. I slowly opened it again. His handwriting was as familiar as his voice. No matter where life takes us, thank you for always being my safe place. I read that sentence 3 times before realizing my vision had blurred. At that exact moment, my phone vibrated with an incoming call from my older cousin Daniel, someone I had always trusted because he listened without judging. He immediately noticed something was wrong. Instead of pretending everything was fine, I surprised myself by asking whether we could meet for coffee the next morning. Of course, he answered without hesitation. Whatever it is, you do not have to carry it alone. After the call ended, I looked once more at the birthday card resting in my hands. For years, I had believed the greatest challenge of my life was becoming someone different. Now, for the first time, another possibility quietly emerged. Maybe the real challenge was finding the courage to admit that the person I had been trying so hard to change had never actually been broken at all. The next morning, I met my cousin Daniel at a quiet coffee shop overlooking the Chicago River, a place where conversations always seemed easier because nobody felt rushed. He arrived carrying 2 cups of coffee, smiled the same easy smile he had worn since we were children, and sat across from me without asking unnecessary questions. You look like someone who has been fighting himself for a long time, he said gently. I laughed without any real humor. That obvious? He nodded. Only to someone who has known you your whole life. For several minutes, I stared through the window at people walking along the river walk before finally speaking. Have you ever spent years trying to become someone else because you thought it would make everyone happier? Daniel did not answer immediately. Who are you trying to become? I lowered my eyes toward the coffee cup, warming my hands. Someone simpler. Someone who does not complicate his own life. Daniel leaned back thoughtfully. And has it worked? I smiled sadly. Not even a little. The silence between us felt comfortable instead of awkward. Finally, I whispered the sentence I had never said aloud before. I think I have spent years trying to convince myself that if I could stop loving one particular person, everything else would finally make sense. Daniel looked at me with quiet understanding rather than surprise. Does that person know? I slowly shook my head. He does not even know that I have been pushing him away. Daniel nodded once. Then you have not been protecting yourself, Ethan. You have been punishing both of you. Those words settled deeply inside me. They sounded painfully accurate. I explained everything that had happened during the past several weeks. The unanswered messages, the uncomfortable dates, the notebook filled with promises, and the growing distance between Bennett and me. Daniel listened without interrupting until I finished. Then he asked only one question. When you imagine your happiest memory from the last 10 years, who is standing beside you? I did not have to think. Bennett. And when you imagine your future after all this pretending? My answer came much more slowly. He is not there. Daniel nodded gently. How does that future feel? I looked back toward the river, watching sunlight reflect across the water. Lonely. He offered a small smile. Then maybe you already know which version of your life is honest. We finished our coffee and walked outside together. Before leaving, Daniel rested a hand on my shoulder. The people who truly love you are not waiting for you to become someone else. They are waiting for you to stop hiding. I thanked him quietly before driving toward my apartment with more clarity than I had felt in months. That evening I decided I would finally answer Bennett's recent messages instead of waiting hours or inventing another excuse. As I unlocked my front door, I noticed an envelope resting on the welcome mat with my name written across the front in Bennett's familiar handwriting. My heartbeat immediately quickened. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper and an old photograph from our college graduation. I unfolded the note with slightly trembling hands. The first sentence stole every remaining breath from my lungs. I do not know what changed, Ethan, but if I have somehow become the reason you no longer feel comfortable around me, I would rather know the truth than slowly lose my best friend without understanding why. I stood motionless in the quiet hallway reading those words again and again, suddenly realizing that while I had spent weeks trying to hide from my own heart, Bennett had been silently blaming himself for a distance he never created. And in that heartbreaking moment, I knew I could no longer postpone the conversation that had the power to change both of our lives forever. For a long time I stood in the hallway holding Bennett's letter, unable to move because every sentence carried the weight of weeks I could never get back. He had believed he was the problem, while I had been desperately trying to convince myself that I was. Neither of us had been living honestly. I folded the letter, carefully slipped it back into the envelope, and reached for my phone before fear could interrupt me again. My fingers hesitated only once before I typed a single message. Can we meet tonight? I owe you the truth. His reply arrived less than a minute later. Of course. Same coffee shop. I smiled for the first time in days. Yes. The familiar neighborhood cafe looked exactly as it always had, yet everything felt different as I stepped through the front door that evening. Bennett was already there, sitting by the large window where we had spent countless Saturday mornings talking about everything and nothing. When he saw me, he stood immediately. His expression carried relief, concern, and quiet uncertainty all at once. Neither of us reached for an easy joke this time. We simply sat across from each other while the sound of gentle rain tapped against the glass outside. Bennett looked at me patiently. You said you owed me the truth. I took a slow breath. I do. My voice felt unsteady, but I refused to hide behind another excuse. Everything that happened these past few weeks was never about you. He remained silent, giving me space to continue. I kept telling myself I needed to change who I was because I thought it would make life easier. I thought if I stayed away from you, eventually these feelings would disappear. Bennett frowned slightly, not in anger, but in confusion. What feelings? My heartbeat became impossibly loud. I looked directly into his eyes because he deserved honesty after every lie I had told myself. The feelings I have carried for years. I paused before quietly adding, I have been trying to convince myself that caring about you this deeply was something I needed to fix. The cafe seemed to disappear around us. Bennett did not interrupt. He did not look shocked. He simply listened with the same kindness he had always shown me. Every date I accepted, I continued. Every message I ignored, every excuse I invented, none of it happened because you did something wrong. I thought I could force myself into becoming someone different. Instead, I only hurt the person who has always mattered most to me. My eyes lowered toward the untouched coffee between us. I am sorry. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, yet it felt like an entire lifetime. Then Bennett spoke so softly, I almost missed his words. Ethan, do you know what hurt the most? I slowly shook my head. watching you suffer alone while believing I could not help you anymore. I looked back up. His eyes were calm, warm, and completely sincere. I never needed you to become someone else. He smiled gently. I only wanted my best friend back. Emotion tightened my throat. I do not know what happens after tonight, I admitted. Neither do I, Bennett answered honestly. But I know we should stop making decisions based on fear. He reached across the table and rested his hand beside mine without rushing or demanding anything in return. Let us begin with the truth. We can figure out everything else together. For the first time in years, I did not feel the need to defend myself, explain myself, or apologize for existing. I simply looked at the person who had patiently waited through every wall I had built, and as hope quietly replaced fear, I realized the future I had been chasing had never been somewhere else. It had been sitting across the table from me all along. The morning after our conversation, I woke with a feeling I had almost forgotten existed. For the first time in years, I was not planning how to hide from myself. I was simply wondering what honesty would look like when it became part of everyday life. Bennett and I agreed not to rush anything. Neither of us wanted one emotional evening to define our future. Instead, we decided to begin where everything had always started, with friendship built on trust. The difference was that nothing important would remain unspoken anymore. Over the following weeks, our conversations became deeper than they had ever been before. We talked about our fears, the expectations we had carried since childhood, the pressure to fit into lives that never truly belonged to us, and the quiet loneliness that comes from believing something essential about yourself needs to be repaired. Every time I admitted another truth, Bennett listened with the same patience that had carried me through every difficult season of my life. One Saturday afternoon, we returned to the same lakeside trail near my parents' house, where we had spent countless summers hiking together. The colorful autumn leaves drifted slowly across the path as we walked without any destination except enjoying the peaceful afternoon. You know, Bennett said with a gentle smile, I kept trying to understand why you pushed me away. I blamed myself more times than I can count. I looked at him with sincere regret. I know. Reading your letter made me realize how unfair I had been. He shook his head softly. We both spent too much time believing fear instead of each other. We continued walking until we reached the quiet wooden dock where our difficult conversation had begun weeks earlier. Standing in the same place now felt completely different. The silence no longer carried uncertainty. It carried understanding. I looked across the calm water before turning toward him. Thank you for waiting, I said quietly. Bennett smiled with the familiar warmth that had first made me feel safe years ago. You were always worth waiting for. A month later, my family gathered again, this time to celebrate my sister's wedding. The atmosphere was filled with laughter, music, and joyful conversations. As guests arrived, my mother gently squeezed my shoulder. You seem happier, she said. I smiled honestly. I finally stopped trying to become someone else. She nodded without asking another question, simply accepting the peace she saw on my face. During the reception, Bennett stood beside me exactly where he had naturally belonged through every important chapter of my life. When relatives asked whether we had come together, I answered with quiet confidence instead of hesitation. Yes, I said. We are together. No dramatic speeches followed. No grand confrontation interrupted the celebration. There were only warm smiles, heartfelt congratulations, and the comforting realization that the people who truly loved me cared far more about my happiness than the imaginary expectations I had carried for so many years. As the evening sun settled behind the trees, Bennett and I stepped outside for a moment of quiet, away from the music. He looked at me with the same gentle expression that had greeted me at my apartment door so many weeks before, carrying 2 cups of coffee because he believed I might need one. This time I smiled before he even spoke. I spent years trying to fix something that was never broken, I admitted. Bennett laughed softly. Then maybe today is not about becoming someone new. I nodded as hope settled peacefully inside my heart. Maybe today is simply the first day I finally get to be myself. We stood together beneath the golden evening sky, grateful for every difficult step that had led us there, and I realized the greatest change in my life had never been learning how to love someone else. It had been learning that accepting myself was the only thing that had ever made room for the future we had quietly been building together all along. Life did not become perfect after that evening beneath the golden sky, but it became honest, and honesty brought a kind of peace I had never experienced before. Bennett and I continued building our relationship one ordinary day at a time instead of chasing dramatic milestones. We learned that love looked less like grand declarations and more like small moments repeated consistently. It was sharing breakfast before work on busy mornings, reminding each other to rest after difficult days, celebrating small victories, and laughing over stories we had already told dozens of times. The greatest difference was that I no longer questioned whether I deserved those moments. Several weeks after my sister's wedding, our architecture firm announced a charity project renovating a neighborhood community center. Volunteers from different companies would spend weekends working alongside local residents to redesign classrooms and public gathering spaces. When I mentioned the opportunity over dinner, Bennett immediately smiled. "You know I am going to volunteer too." I laughed. "I knew you would say that." Saturday arrived with bright autumn sunshine and a cool breeze that carried the scent of freshly cut grass through the neighborhood. Families, students, and volunteers worked together painting walls, assembling bookshelves, planting flowers, and creating welcoming spaces for children. Watching Bennett greet complete strangers with the same warmth he always showed the people closest to him reminded me why I had admired him long before I understood the true depth of my feelings. He treated everyone as though they mattered, never expecting recognition in return. During our lunch break, we sat beneath a large oak tree with sandwiches wrapped in paper bags. A group of children ran across the nearby playground, laughing without a single worry about how they were supposed to live or who they were supposed to become. I watched them quietly before saying, "I spent so many years believing life would only begin after I changed myself." Bennett looked toward the playground before answering. "Maybe life was waiting for you to stop asking permission to be yourself." His words settled gently instead of painfully. That difference meant everything. Later that afternoon, one of my coworkers approached with a friendly smile. "You two make a great team," she said. "You always seem to understand what the other person is thinking." I glanced toward Bennett, who happened to be carrying a stack of paint supplies at exactly the moment I realized he needed help without him saying a word. We both reached the supplies at the same time and laughed because we had made the exact same decision. "Years of practice," Bennett answered with an easy grin. Driving home that evening, I noticed something I had never allowed myself to notice before. There was no fear sitting beside me anymore. There was only gratitude. Gratitude for the conversations I almost avoided, the truths I almost buried, and the person who had quietly remained patient while I found the courage to stop hiding. When we reached my apartment building, Bennett turned off the engine but did not reach for the door immediately. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Anything." He smiled thoughtfully. "If you could talk to the version of yourself from a few months ago, the one writing that list about becoming someone different, what would you tell him?" I looked through the windshield at the familiar city lights before answering with complete certainty. I would tell him that the strongest people are not the ones who hide their hearts. They are the ones who finally trust them. Bennett's smile grew warmer than ever, and as we walked toward my apartment together, I realized that every step forward now felt lighter because I was no longer carrying the impossible weight of pretending to be someone I had never been. Winter arrived quietly, covering the city with a thin layer of snow that transformed familiar streets into something peaceful and new. Looking out from my apartment window one Saturday morning, I realized the changing season felt strangely symbolic. Everything around me looked different, yet it had always been the same place beneath the surface. The only real change had happened inside me. Bennett arrived carrying 2 cups of coffee, smiling as though bringing my favorite drink had become an unspoken tradition that neither of us ever wanted to end. This time I greeted him at the door without hesitation, grateful that I no longer believed happiness was something I needed to earn by pretending to be someone else. "Ready?" he asked. "For what?" I laughed. "For helping my parents decorate for the holidays," he replied. "My mother specifically requested your talent because apparently I hang lights in completely crooked lines." I smiled. She is probably right. We drove across town with holiday music playing softly through the speakers, talking about work, travel plans, and the community center project that had finally opened its renovated classrooms. Life no longer revolved around avoiding difficult conversations. Instead, we talked about the future as though it naturally belonged to both of us. Bennett's parents welcomed us with warm hugs and familiar laughter. His mother immediately placed a box of ornaments into my hands as though I had always been part of the family tradition. His father smiled while pretending to supervise from the living room, offering humorous advice every few minutes that nobody actually followed. The afternoon passed with light-hearted conversations, homemade cookies, and countless stories from years we had all shared together. At one point, Bennett disappeared upstairs to find another box of decorations, leaving me alone in the kitchen with his mother while she prepared hot chocolate. She looked at me with a gentle smile before quietly saying, "I have not seen him this happy in a very long time." I looked down at the mug warming my hands. "Neither have I." She nodded knowingly. "Whatever changed, thank you for bringing his smile back." Emotion caught me by surprise because I had spent so many years fearing how people might react to the truth. Instead, I kept discovering kindness in places where fear had convinced me only rejection existed. Later that evening, Bennett and I stepped outside onto the snow-covered porch while the first holiday lights across the neighborhood began glowing against the darkening sky. The cold air carried the quiet stillness that only winter evenings seemed to create. Bennett slipped his hands into his jacket pockets and looked toward the softly illuminated houses lining the street. "Do you remember the notebook?" he asked. I laughed quietly. "I wish I did not. I think about it sometimes," he admitted. "Not because of what you wrote, but because of how different you look now." I smiled thoughtfully. Back then, I believed changing myself would solve everything. Bennett turned toward me with the same calm expression that had guided me through every uncertain chapter of my life. And now, I looked across the peaceful neighborhood before answering with complete honesty. Now I know that accepting myself allowed everything else to finally fall into place. He smiled, and neither of us felt the need to say anything more. The silence between us no longer held questions waiting to be answered. It carried gratitude, trust, and the quiet certainty that the life we were building together no longer depended on fear, only on the simple choice to keep showing up for each other every single day. By early spring, the snow had melted away, revealing the familiar sidewalks and parks that had quietly waited beneath the winter all along. One Saturday morning, Bennett and I returned to the neighborhood coffee shop, where everything had finally changed months earlier. The same corner table beside the window was available, and we smiled the moment we noticed it. "Some places never stop feeling like home," Bennett said as we sat down with our coffee. "Maybe because they remember every version of us," I replied. We spent the morning talking about ordinary things that suddenly felt extraordinary simply because they were no longer overshadowed by fear. We planned a short road trip along the shores of Lake Michigan for the beginning of summer, discussed a new architecture project my firm had accepted, and laughed over the fact that Bennett still insisted on ordering pastries he claimed he would share even though he usually finished most of them himself. Watching him laugh so freely reminded me that genuine happiness rarely arrives through dramatic moments. More often, it grows quietly through countless ordinary days spent beside the right person. A few weeks later, my parents invited us for Sunday dinner. This invitation felt different because nothing needed to be explained anymore. There were no carefully rehearsed answers, no hidden emotions, and no exhausting effort to appear like someone I was not. My mother greeted both of us warmly at the front door before asking Bennett whether he could help my father prepare the backyard for the first family barbecue of the season. As I watched the two of them walk outside together, my grandmother stepped beside me with the gentle smile that always seemed to carry more wisdom than words. "You look lighter," she said softly. I nodded. I finally stopped carrying something that never belonged to me. She reached for my hand and gave it a reassuring squeeze. "The world asks people to carry many unnecessary burdens," she replied. "The greatest gift is learning which ones to put down." Her words stayed with me throughout the afternoon. During dinner, the conversations flowed naturally from travel plans to family memories, future holidays, and stories from our childhood. At one point, my younger sister smiled across the table. "You remember that game we played at the lake house?" she asked. I laughed immediately because I knew exactly which one she meant. The honest question. She nodded. "If I asked you the same question today, would your answer be different?" I looked around the table at the people who had supported me more than I had ever allowed myself to believe possible. Then I looked toward Bennett, who met my eyes with quiet encouragement. "Yes," I answered confidently. "My biggest secret is not a secret anymore." The room fell peacefully silent before my father smiled with unmistakable pride. "That sounds like the answer of someone who finally found peace." I realized he was right. Peace had not arrived because every challenge disappeared. Peace arrived because I stopped fighting the person I saw in the mirror every morning. As the evening ended, Bennett and I remained outside on the backyard patio while the last colors of sunset stretched across the horizon. The gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers through the quiet neighborhood. I rested comfortably beside him, grateful that silence no longer frightened me because nothing meaningful remained unsaid between us. Looking toward the fading sunlight, I quietly realized that for years I had searched for a version of myself worthy of love, only to discover that love had been patiently waiting for me the entire time, asking for nothing except the courage to finally believe that I had always been enough. Several months later, summer returned to Chicago with bright mornings, warm evenings, and the comforting feeling that life had quietly settled into the rhythm I had once believed was impossible. Looking back, it was difficult to recognize the person who had stood alone in his apartment convinced that he needed to become someone else before he deserved happiness. That version of me had measured every decision through fear. The person I had become measured life very differently. I measured it through peace. Bennett and I spent our weekends exploring small lakeside towns, visiting local bookstores, trying new restaurants, and finding excuses to stop for coffee even when neither of us actually needed another cup. None of those moments were extraordinary by themselves, yet together they became the life I had secretly hoped for long before I believed I could ever have it. One Saturday morning we returned to the community center where we had volunteered months earlier. Children filled the renovated classrooms with laughter while parents thanked the volunteers who had helped transform the building into a welcoming place for neighborhood families. As we walked through the bright hallways, one little boy pointed toward a colorful mural Bennett had helped paint. "Did you make that?" he asked with wide eyes. Bennett smiled modestly. "A lot of people made it together." The boy nodded happily before running back to his friends. I watched him disappear around the corner and quietly realized that Bennett had always lived that way. He never searched for recognition. He simply made every place he entered a little warmer than he found it. Before leaving, the community director handed us a framed photograph taken during the renovation project. Dozens of volunteers filled the picture, but my eyes immediately found the two of us standing side by side, smiling without hesitation. "You should keep this," Bennett said. I shook my head with a grateful smile. "We should keep it." That single word felt meaningful because it represented everything I had spent years trying to avoid. There was no longer my future and his future. There was simply our future. Later that evening, we walked along the Chicago River as the city lights reflected across the calm water. The same skyline that had once witnessed my loneliness now witnessed something entirely different. I reached into my jacket pocket and unfolded the small piece of paper I had carried for weeks. Bennett looked at me curiously. "What is that?" I laughed softly. "Remember the notebook?" He smiled immediately. Unfortunately, I unfolded the page. It was the original list titled New Beginning, the one that had once contained 3 promises built on fear. A pen rested in my pocket. I crossed out every sentence until the page was almost empty, then wrote a new list beneath the old one. Number 1, tell the truth. Number 2, choose love over fear. Number 3, never apologize for being yourself. I handed the paper to Bennett. He read it slowly before looking back at me with eyes full of quiet understanding. "I like this version much better," he said. "So do I." We folded the page together and tucked it safely back into my pocket, not because we needed to remember the fear anymore, but because it reminded us how far we had come. As the evening breeze drifted across the river, I understood that nothing in my life had ever needed fixing except the belief that I had to earn the right to be accepted. The greatest gift I received was never simply finding love. It was discovering that the moment I accepted myself completely, I also found the courage to accept the love that had patiently waited beside me all along. And with Bennett walking beside me into every new tomorrow, I finally knew that the life I had once searched for was no longer ahead of me. I was already living it.